is Damon Fordham, author and historian, and I'm going to tell you this morning about a lesser-known aspect of American history. Now, many of us grew up watching cowboy shows such as Lucas McCain the Rifleman and the Lone Ranger and Gunsmoke and Bonanza, the Big Valley, and a variety of shows of this type. And many of these shows provided us in our youth with a lot of adventure and excitement, as well as stories that told us the values of courage and standing up for what is right and loyalty to the family and such things. Anyway, a lot of people don't know that in those days you had a large number of black cowboys, and this has often escaped the attention of television, except for back in the late 60s you had Otis Young appearing in a show called The Outcasts, as well as Sammy Davis Jr. appearing in such shows as Lucas McCain the Rifleman on several occasions. Now, however, there are some wonderful stories about real blacks out there in the Old West back in the day. And I'm going to talk about two of those this morning. One of them deals with this guy, Bass Reeves, who Art T. Burton wrote about in this book, Black Gun, Silver Star, the life and legend of Frontier Marshal Bass Reeves. Now many people have probably heard this stuff about Bass Reeves being the inspiration for the Lone Ranger. Well, okay, folks, before we get any further into this, let me clear that up right now, all right? Now, the author, Art Burton, mentions early on that there is I doubt that we would be able to prove conclusively that Reeves is the inspiration for the Lone Ranger. Well, I did some research on that, and, I hate to burst some people's bubble on this, but back in 1914, you had the great Western writer Zane Grey, and this is an original copy of a book he wrote in 1914 called The Lone Star Ranger. And in it, he begins by dedicating this book to Captain John Hughes, who basically was a leader of the Texas Rangers back in the late 1800s. And I did some research on John Hughes, and he was acknowledged as the real version of the Lone Ranger before his death by suicide in the late 1940s. There were a number of newspaper stories about that. So no, Bass Reeves was not the Lone Ranger. But he did so many other great things that he deserves his place as a true American hero. Now, what Art T. Burton did in this book was he went to a bunch of old people in Oklahoma, where Bass Reeves practiced as a deputy marshal, and he interviewed these old people who remembered stories about him, and then he went through all these old court records and found these fascinating instances, as well as old newspapers from Oklahoma that told of the exploits of Bass Reeves, and he put them all in this book. And I'm going to tell you folks, this is great reading by the fireplace in the wintertime, or on your front porch in the summer or spring, or if you're reading to a bunch of kids who like stories of adventure. This is one great book. Let me share a few of the adventures of Bass Reeves that are discussed in this book. He once found this story about near Ulaga, or near a place called Ulaga, Oklahoma, where he talks about how, get this, while making his rounds, Bass Reeves came across a lynch mob near one of the large cattle ranchers. Evidently, a rustler had been caught, and one was about to be strung up to a tree on the prairie by a group of cowboys. Without any thought to the danger that he might be in, Reeves rode straight up to the lynch mob, cut the man down with his knife, and rode off with the man, without saying a word to anyone. It so astonished everyone that he was not pursued. Wow. Is that wild or what? Yeah, and now a little bit about Bass Reeves' background. He was born a slave in Arkansas in 1838. And after slavery, he somehow migrated over to the West, and he wound up in Muskogee, Oklahoma, where he became a deputy marshal. And here are a couple of other really interesting adventures regarding Bass Reeves. Another document written about 1938, a guy named Adam Grayson recalled this story about Bass Reeves, that he was out to get a couple of outlaws on one occasion, and what he decided to do was to go to a home where he heard where the outlaws were staying with their mothers, right? So what he did was he dressed up like a tramp And he went there and asked for a bite to eat, talked about how hungry he was and how his feet were blistered and so on and so forth. And so, get this. The lady at the house took him in and felt sorry for him and fed him, right? And there were the outlaws right there at the table. So, well, Bass was hungry and tired, so he went ahead and ate. And he slept, on the other side of the room and so the other side of the house. And when he got up the next morning, he pulls out his gun. "Okay, fellas, you're under arrest," and took them into custody while the guy's mother was behind, who fed him, was behind him, cursing him all the way through. I tell you, this guy was really something else. And among other stories, and one of the really great ones is the one that he tells about how the time he tried to capture these two Texas outlaws. And he went up to the Texas outlaws, right? And so he was about to arrest them, but get this. One of them said, "I don't speak to black news." And he's like, uh-oh. So he had to think. So now Bass Reeves, you have to remember, he couldn't read or write. So what he did was this. He pulled a little trick on these guys. He pulled out, and the two Texas bad men, one very tall and one very short. They pulled out his gun and said they were going to kill him. So Bass started thinking quickly. He said, "Well, fellas, I have one last request while I'm here." And the fellas said, "What's that?" And he said, "Well, I have a letter here from my wife, but I can't read it. So could one of you gentlemen read it for me?" And one of the big tower cowboys said, "Well, you don't have much long for this world anyway. I might as well." So Bass gave the cowboy his letter, and the cowboy took two of his hands. He was going to read the letter. So Bass quickly reached over and put the guy into a chokehold, and then grabbed the guy's gun and pulled the gun on two of the guys and said, "All right, fellas, you're under arrest." I tell you, Bass Reeves this guy is just phenomenal. You will really enjoy this book. He died in 1910, and I'm so glad that Art Burton took the time to preserve this guy's memory for some really fascinating stories. Now, the next great book about black cowboys I'm going to speak about was an autobiography written in 1907 by Nat Love called The Life and Adventures of Nat Love. You may have probably seen this picture floating about before, but here's the story behind Nat Love. He was born a slave in Tennessee in 1854. And after freedom, he scrounged around to help his family, but then at 15, he figured that he couldn't really make it out in Tennessee during Reconstruction, so he made his way out west, where he met and rode with such people as the Dalton Gang. He knew Jesse James and Billy the Kid and Wyatt Earp and all of these guys that you see in the cowboy stories. Now, granted, some of what he said was obviously tall tales, but it's such entertaining reading. One tale talks about how he was captured by an American Indian chief named Yellow Dog, and the chief wanted him to marry his daughter and all of that, and how he managed to forcefully escape his way from the tribe. And then on another occasion, he was out on the range one day, and he had nothing better to do, so he took his rope and lasso and actually lassoed a train that was coming by, and the lasso got the train by the smokestack and dragged him for X amount of miles, right? Then he tells another really great story about how he was in Mexico, right, rustling cattle, and he was thirsty and wanted to go into the bar. So he rides by this bar and the saloon, and had those wide open doors, but he didn't feel like getting off of his horse. So get this. According to Nat Love, he rode his horse into the bar while still on the saddle, ordering his drink. He got a drink and even got a drink for his horse, and the people surrounding this were so outraged by that they were about to chase him out at gunpoint, but he pulls out his 6-shooter and starts shooting his way blazing out of the bar. And he eventually retired as a railroad porter and settled down to be a family man and lived a very productive life and wrote this great book, The Life and Adventures of Nat Love. So I encourage you strongly to look into these stories of Bass Reeves and Nat Love, because not only is this stuff very entertaining reading, it'll give young people something really interesting to aspire to see themselves as being these great heroes of the Old West, just as so many others have over the years with the Lone Ranger and all the rest. This is Damon Fordham talking about black cowboys of the Old West.